Imagine writing, like, the absolute perfect constitution.
Right, the ultimate foundational document.
Exactly. Let's say you and a team of brilliant minds draft this document, and it is flawless. I mean, it guarantees equality for everyone.
No exceptions.
Yeah, no exceptions. It completely dismantles unjust hierarchies. It prevents the hoarding of wealth. And it sets up this society where nobody, not a king, not a priest, not a billionaire, is above the law.
A truly flat system.
Right. And it's written down, it's locked in, and it actually starts working. But then within just a few generations, the elites figure out a way to completely hijack that system.
They always do.
They return society to the old ways of absolute power. And here is the crazy part. They do it without changing a single word of that original document.
Yeah, it is basically the ultimate systemic heist. And it's a scenario that has played out, time and time again throughout human history.
Exactly. So today on this deep dive, we are looking at a text that is over 1,400 years old, but honestly, it reads like a modern manual on systems engineering and sociological resilience.
It really does.
We are dissecting exactly how egalitarian systems get hacked, and more importantly, how they are actually designed to survive those hacks.
Right. And for you listening, we really need to establish the ground rules right away here.
Definitely.
We are going to be looking at a foundational text, specifically Surah Al-Hajj, Ayat 52 and 53. And we're looking at this through the analytical lens of Lecture 8 from the Tulu-e-Islam digital audio series.
Which was delivered by Ghulam Ahmad Parwez.
Exactly. But, and this is crucial, we are not here to give a theological sermon today.
Zero preaching. None.
Yeah, no preaching, no religious sentimentality. What we are doing is treating this text as an intensely rational, high-energy blueprint for civilizational survival.
Because that's how Parwez approaches it, right?
Exactly. He approaches this not as some mystic, but almost as a sociologist or, a systems architect who is analyzing how ideological movements protect themselves from internal decay.
Right. And the hook for this entire framework, the reality that verse 2252 just drops right in our laps, is this inevitable, almost mathematical constant.
The hack.
The hack. Into every single historical reform program, every time a messenger or a reformer tries to establish an equitable system, a corrupting suggestion is injected into the movement.
It's unavoidable.
Yeah. The text literally refers to it as what Satan casts. But Parwez makes it very clear that we aren't talking about, like, supernatural bogeymen here.
No, not at all.
We are talking about human adversaries.
Yeah.
Vested interests.
The elites.
Exactly. The people who stand to lose all their unearned power when equality actually becomes the law of the land.
Right. The text establishes that no system, no matter how perfectly crafted or divinely inspired, is completely immune to attempted hacks.
It's just human nature.
It is. If you build a system that redistributes power back to the regular people, the former power brokers will try to find a backdoor. That is just human sociology 101.
But see, verse 2253 provides the mechanism for how the system handles this injection of malware. And this is what completely blew my mind.
It's a total paradigm shift.
It really is. The architect of the system, the intelligence behind the original code, doesn't instantly vaporize the hackers.
Right.
The system actually allows this injected falsehood to circulate. It allows it to become what the text calls a fitna, a trial, and specifically for two types of people.
Those in whose hearts is disease and those whose hearts are hardened.
Yes, which forces us right off the bat to completely reframe how we view historical corruption. Because when you first hear that, your instinct is probably to think, wait, if the original Constitution is perfect, why would the designer allow malware to enter the network at all?
It feels like a massive glitch.
That's exactly what I thought. I mean,
Right.
Why not just build a firewall so thick that the system is impenetrable?
Well, because a totally closed system stagnates, What Parwez's analysis reveals is that this allowance isn't a glitch in the civilizational software at all.
It's a feature.
It is a brilliantly designed diagnostic feature. The falsehood is allowed to enter and circulate briefly so that the system can automatically sort its populace.
Okay, I really want to slow down here. Because this concept of the distortion actually being a filter, it's so counterintuitive, but it's incredibly profound.
It really changes everything about how you view societal conflict.
It does. And to really understand how this superficial translations.
Yeah, the common translations do a massive disservice here.
Right, because the word fitna gets thrown around a lot in casual conversation today. And usually it gets translated as a calamity or a disaster or, some kind of divine punishment.
Yes, the common usage has completely lost the technical precision of the original root word.
So what is the root?
When you look at the etymology of fitna, you aren't looking at a disaster. You are actually looking at metallurgy.
Metallurgy, like working with metals.
Exactly. The root of the word refers specifically to the physical process of assaying metal.
Okay, break that down for me.
So imagine you pull raw, unrefined gold or silver ore out of the ground. In that natural state, it's practically useless. It's not, a shiny, perfect ingot.
Right, it's just a rock.
It is bound up with dirt, with slag, with dross, and with cheaper base metals. So if you want to know what is actually valuable in that rock, what do you have to do?
You have to throw it into a blazing fire.
Precisely. You introduce extreme, blistering heat. Now think about what the fire does. The fire doesn't destroy the gold.
No, gold can handle the heat.
Right. The fire melts the mass, and the impurities, the dross, and the slag, they rise to the surface where they can easily be skimmed off.
I see.
So the fire is a test that separates, it clarifies, it is a highly active process of revealing the true nature of the materials. It doesn't punish the metal, it authenticates it.
Okay, wow. So if you pull that analogy out of the blacksmith's forge and put it back into our sociological system's blueprint, the community, the entire civilization is that raw, unrefined ore.
Correct. When a new egalitarian constitution is introduced, a lot of people join the movement.
Sure, it's a popular movement.
But they join for all sorts of reasons. Some genuinely believe in the objective principles, while others, just want to be on the winning team, or they see a new path to personal power.
So the injected falsa, this counterfeit ideology, pushed by the vested interest that acts as the fire.
Yes. The counterfeit idea is introduced into the discourse, and it creates a social fire. It creates intense friction and debate.
And it forces everyone to react.
Exactly. And the text lays out the chemical reaction, so to speak. Sound conviction repels this fire. The pure gold remains completely unaffected by the fake ideology.
But there are elements that bond with it.
Right. Two specific elements in the social ore actually embrace the fire and bond with the counterfeit.
And those are the two groups mentioned in the verse. Those with diseased hearts, which the text calls marad, and those with hardened hearts, or qaswa.
Those are the exact terms.
I want to visualize this practically. What does a diseased heart look like, not in a medical sense, but as a sociological demographic? Like, who are these people?
Well, in this specific framework, a diseased heart represents someone with an active sickness in their socioeconomic outlook.
Okay.
These are the opportunists. They are the individuals who secretly harbor a vested interest in the old, unequal, hierarchical order.
They miss the old days.
Exactly. Think about it. An egalitarian system where a daily wage earner has the exact same legal and social standing as a former aristocrat is deeply threatening if you used to be the aristocrat.
Oh, absolutely.
Their disease is their active, burning desire to maintain unearned power over others.
So they are participating in the new system on the surface, but they deeply resent the equality it enforces.
Yes.
It's kind of like, okay, imagine a middle manager who survives a big corporate restructuring into a flat hierarchy.
Right, right.
But secretly, they spend all day trying to figure out how to get their private office and executive parking spot back. They hate being equal to the junior staff.
That is a perfect modern analogy. So when a counterfeit idea enters the ideological ecosystem, like a new rule or a shifted interpretation that secretly offers a loophole for them to regain that elevated status, they don't analyze it critically.
No, they don't want to.
They eagerly, desperately embrace it.
Because it cures their specific disease. It cures that feeling of not being superior to everyone else.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the opportunists. What about the second group? The hardened hearts.
The hardened hearts represent intellectual rigidity, petrification. These are the people who are deeply, deeply entrenched in blind tradition, in the comforting routine of the way things have always been.
So they aren't necessarily the elites.
No, they haven't necessarily been aristocrats at all. They might just be the general masses. But they have completely lost the capacity, or really the willingness, for critical, independent thought.
They just don't want to do the heavy lifting of reasoning for themselves.
Precisely. Because an active, intellect-driven system requires responsibility. You have to understand the Constitution, apply it, and actively participate.
Which is work.
It is exhausting for someone whose mind is petrified. So when someone introduces a corrupted idea that feels familiar, maybe it brings back the old rituals they grew up with.
Right, the stuff their ancestors did.
Yeah, or old superstitions that don't require them to think, but just require them to blindly obey. They latch onto it like a life raft. They eagerly trade the responsibility of reason for the comfort of blind obedience.
Man, this mechanism is breathtaking. When you look at it as a system, the benefit here is wild.
It's incredibly efficient.
The movement doesn't need to establish a secret police. It doesn't have to go on some crazy witch hunt to find the traitors or the opportunists.
No, it just lets them expose themselves.
It literally just lets a piece of obvious self-serving malware into the network and then steps back and watches who willingly downloads it. The counterfeit itself is the sorting mechanism.
It is an automatic self-executing audit of the entire civilization.
That is so cool.
Right. If you want to know who genuinely understands the Constitution and who is secretly harboring a desire to be an aristocrat, you just wait for a piece of aristocratic propaganda to be injected into the discourse.
And whoever cheers for it.
The people who cheer for it have just assayed themselves as slag.
Okay, I love that. But I have to push back here a little bit. I'm struggling with the mechanics of this, practically speaking. Let's step into what we can call the engine of reason.
Okay, let's do it.
If the authentic code, the original Constitution, is intellectually superior, guarantees equal rights, and actually improves society, why does this malware successfully infect anyone at all?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. I mean, if the elite's propaganda is so obviously a power grab, why would average people ever cheer for an ideology that eventually strips them of their own rights? Is it just fear of the elites, or is there something deeply comforting about this fake version?
That is literally the most crucial question you can ask about human history. Why do the masses ever vote for their own subjugation? To understand this, we have to look at the exact term the source text uses for this corrupting data. It calls it Zukhruf al-Qawl.
Zukhruf al-Qawl. What does that actually mean?
It translates literally to gilded speech, or a highly decorative, glittering deception. Let's think about the physical act of gilding for a second.
Like with actual gold?
Yes.
Yeah.
You take a cheap, heavy, toxic base metal like lead. Now, you can't sell a block of lead to people. It's ugly, it's poisonous, no one wants it.
Right.
So you paint a microscopic, brilliant layer of pure gold over it. To the untrained eye, or crucially, to the eye that wants to be fooled, it looks like a solid brick of pure gold. It's beautiful.
But underneath, it's just toxic lead.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what does gilded speech look like in a society? It is heavily emotional. It sounds incredibly pious. It sounds intensely spiritual and beautiful.
Okay, I'm tracking.
But its functional purpose, the lead underneath all that pretty language, is to put human reason to sleep and transfer power back to an elite class.
Okay, can we make this really concrete? Because Parwez's lecture references the philosopher-poet Allama Iqbal quite a bit to explain this.
He does, yeah.
Iqbal talked extensively about this Persian or Ajam influence on the original egalitarian movement.
How did this gilding process actually happen historically?
Let's paint the picture. The original egalitarian movement, as Parwez points out, was highly active. It was deeply rational and intensely socioeconomic.
It was about real life.
Exactly. It was about establishing equity in the real physical world. Leaders were held accountable in public squares by ordinary citizens. The treasury belonged to the people.
A working, practical constitution.
Right. There were no divine kings, no secret spiritual hierarchies. But then this movement expands, and it encounters and eventually integrates massive imperial structures like the Persian Empire.
Which was a totally different beast.
Completely different. Think about the sociological reality of the Persian Empire before this integration. It was an ancient, deeply entrenched civilization built on the absolute divine right of kings.
They had a rigid caste system,
Right.
Very rigid. The elites hoarded staggering wealth, and the masses were conditioned over centuries to view the emperor not just as a guy, but as a literal shadow of God on earth.
Right. You couldn't exactly just walk up to the Persian emperor and ask for an audit of his tax spend.
You'd be executed on the spot.
Yeah.
So now, suddenly, the elites of that empire find themselves subsumed into this new egalitarian system that says, hey, you are no better than the farmer.
Yeah, they must have hated that.
Empires cannot survive on egalitarianism. Kings and emperors need passive, obedient subjects, not equal citizens asking critical questions. So what do the vested interests do?
They have to fight back.
But they can't do it openly. They can't publicly declare, we hate equality, bring back the emperor. They would be rejected immediately by the newly liberated masses.
Right, because the pure gold of the Constitution is too popular. People love their rights.
So they use Zukhruf al-Qawl. They inject gilded speech. They took the vocabulary of the active socioeconomic ideology and they gilded it with deep mysticism.
Oh, wow.
They started injecting narratives that essentially said, yes, equality in this material world is nice, but true elevation is invisible. The real goal isn't to establish justice in the physical world. The real goal is to sit quietly, detach from the world, and achieve a secret spiritual elevation.
That is wild. So they took a political and economic revolution and turned it into like a passive meditation retreat.
Exactly. They turned practical, hard-hitting laws into magical fables. And why did the masses fall for it?
Because it's easier.
It is infinitely easier to sit in a corner and feel spiritually pure than it is to stand up to a tyrant, demand economic justice, and actually build a functioning society.
Yeah, building a society takes actual work.
The gilded speech flattered the ego of the common person, making them feel like an elevated mystic while simultaneously pacifying them so the elites could quietly take back control of the real material wealth and power.
That is the ultimate sleight of hand. You convince the populace that demanding their legal and economic rights is actually a sign of spiritual immaturity.
Yes.
You use the vocabulary of the system to totally disarm the system. It's like modern corporate jargon.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
You see the same dynamic today. A company brings in a consultant who uses highly emotional, beautifully worded mandates about, agile synergy and building a corporate family.
Right. It sounds so nice.
But functionally, the new policy just removes overtime pay and shields the CEO from accountability. It sounds great, but underneath, it's just a power grab. The lead is painted gold.
That is modern Zukhruf al-Qawl. And because this gilded speech is so incredibly attractive to those who want to avoid the hard work of reason, the diseased and hardened hearts, it spreads like a virus.
It just takes over.
But the text makes a vital point here. The genuine adherents, the people actually using their intellect to assay the information, are not fooled. They see the lead underneath the gold paint.
Which naturally leads to a massive societal division. The community fractures.
Yes. The source text calls this extreme schism, or shqaq ba'id. The society splits between those holding on to the active constitution and those retreating into the passive gilded fables.
And what's vital to pull from Parwez's systems analysis here is that this extreme schism isn't imposed on the populace from the top down as some sort of arbitrary punishment.
No, not at all.
It is entirely self-inflicted.
Ah.
The deniers fall into this schism because they actively chose the gilded lie. They chose it because it paid them dividends.
Either in actual power for the elites or in the lazy comfort of avoiding intellectual responsibility for the masses.
Right. It is the ultimate framework of accountability. You cannot blame the architect of the system for your fractured society when you are the one who rejected the solid gold constitution in favor of a glittering counterfeit that stroked your ego.
Exactly. The assaying fire did its job. It's not the fire's fault that you turned out to be dross.
Okay, so we've established why the vested interests want to hack the system and the psychology of why certain people fall for the hack, but I really want to get into the specific mechanics, the how.
Let's get into the mechanics.
How did these vested interests actually manage to legally inject this gilded speech into a finalized constitution? Because if a constitution is written down, codified, and finalized, you can't just cross out a line and write in your own rule.
No, it's physically impossible.
Right. If the U.S. Constitution says freedom of speech, a senator can't just take a Sharpie, cross it out, and write except on Tuesdays. The people would revolt.
Right. You can't attack a finalized constitution through the front door. It's too well defended by the populace. So what do you do from a systems engineering standpoint?
You invent a backdoor.
You invent backdoor channels.
You find exploits in the legal architecture.
Let's talk about those historical case studies of infiltration that Parwez break down, because they are fascinating and honestly terrifying examples of social engineering.
They really are.
The first major exploit he mentions is the tactic of abrogation, or NASC.
This is one of the most staggering historical maneuvers ever pulled off by an elite class.
Really set the stage for this. Okay, so the foundational text, the Quran, was established as a complete finalized code. It was written, memorized, and immutable.
It was locked in.
But the vested interest realized they couldn't just delete the verses that threatened their wealth and power. So over time, a legal doctrine was created and popularized, claiming that certain verses of the Quran, and some scholars claimed over 500 original foundational verses, were abrogated.
Meaning what, exactly, in a legal sense?
Meaning their legal injunctions were canceled, overridden, or nullified by outside later traditions or sayings that were supposedly uttered by the messenger but not actually included in the book.
How on earth did they get away with that? Think about the audacity of that tactic.
Unbelievable.
If I walked into the Supreme Court today and said, hey guys, I found this oral tradition from 1776 passed down from a guy who knew George Washington, and it actually cancels out the First Amendment, I would be laughed out of the room.
You'd be escorted up by security.
Right. So how did the elites market this abrogation to the public so successfully that people just accepted their foundational laws being overridden?
They marketed it using the very Zukhruf al-Qawl, the gilded speech we just talked about. They weaponized reverence.
Weaponized reverence, wow.
They essentially went to the masses and said, oh, you want to rely only on the written book. Don't you love the messenger? Don't you revere his every footstep?
Guilt-tripping them.
Exactly. They said, we have these beautiful secret sayings from him that explain what the book really meant, and sometimes what he said overrides what's written. They made accepting the backdoor exploit a test of your personal piety.
That is so manipulative.
If you rejected the unwritten rule, you were immediately accused of disrespecting the founder of the movement.
That is brilliant in its malice. Instead of fighting the Constitution, which makes you an obvious enemy of the state, you simply claim, ah, yes, that verse is beautiful, but did you know it was secretly canceled by an unwritten rule that only my specific elite scholarly group has the authority to interpret?
Exactly. You bypass the entire Constitution without ever having to physically alter a single document.
It is the classic bypass exploit. You render the primary immutable law moot by subordinating it to secondary, highly malleable data.
Which you control.
Right. And how did they get this secondary data into the system in the first place? That leads to the second exploit Parwez discusses, the time delay tactic.
Right, because these unwritten rules didn't just appear the day after the Constitution was finalized. The source notes that these outside traditions, the ones supposedly overriding the written word, were compiled roughly 250 years after the original messenger.
250 years. Think about how much a society changes in 2.5 centuries.
It's an eternity in sociological terms.
That is roughly the amount of time between the American Revolution and today. Imagine trying to run a country today based solely on oral rumors of what George Washington whispered to his horse, compiled by a guy living in a completely different country.
It's a recipe for total fabrication.
Yes.
And look at who compiled them. These compilations were often put together by individuals operating in vastly different cultural paradigms from the original movement. They were living in an era completely dominated by that Persian imperial mindset we discussed earlier.
So they brought their baggage with them.
Consciously or unconsciously, yes. They projected that imperial hierarchical worldview backward onto the original era of egalitarian movement.
It's generational amnesia. You have a massive gap in time, a complete shift in socioeconomic reality, and suddenly you have thousands of oral traditions appearing that just happen to perfectly support the power structures of the new imperial elites.
What a coincidence, right? And if an intellect-driven citizen challenges these new traditions by saying, wait, the story you're telling completely contradicts the clear written constitution, the elites just deploy the first exploit.
The abrogation.
Right. They say, oh, well, the tradition actually abrogates the Constitution. It is a closed, self-serving loop of logic designed to permanently lock the masses out of the actual system.
Okay, this sounds incredibly bleak. If the elites have these back doors, and they have 250 years of fabricated updates overriding the original code, how does the system defend against this?
It has a built-in defense.
Right. What is the ultimate patch? This brings us to a concept that I find incredibly compelling, not as a theological dogma, but as a hard-coded systemic firewall. Khatm-e-Nubuwwat, or the finality of prophethood.
This is perhaps the most crucial systemic upgrade in the entire civilizational blueprint, and Parwez emphasizes it heavily.
How does it work?
Well, for centuries prior, the way humanity operated was through direct divine intervention. A society would go astray, they would build unjust hierarchies, and a messenger would be sent to correct the course, provide new data, and reset the system.
Right, a firmware update.
But the finality of prophethood marks a hard stop to that cycle. It is an absolute definitive end to exceptional knowledge.
So the channel is closed.
Permanently. It declares that no more direct divine revelation will ever come to humanity. The code is finalized.
Now, at first glance, if you were relying on the system to save you, that sounds terrifying. It sounds like the architect is just abandoning humanity.
But when you look at it sociologically, it's the exact opposite.
How so?
It forces humanity into intellectual maturity. From the moment that finality is declared, humans are told. The Constitution is finalized. It is complete. There is no new secret data coming from the outside. You must now rely on objective reality, on your own intellect, your observation of nature, your historical experience, and the finalized written code.
That is so empowering.
It is the ultimate declaration of human independence.
It is. It's not abandonment. It's emancipation. I liken it to a parent who has been holding onto the back of a child's bicycle for years.
Good analogy.
Eventually, the parent lets go, takes off the training wheels, and says, I'm not holding you up anymore. You know the rules of the road. You know how to balance. Pedal. Figure it out. It breaks the cycle of dependence.
Precisely. And here is where the vested interests strike back with a vengeance. If the front door of exceptional knowledge is permanently sealed, how do the corrupt elites maintain their unearned authority?
Oh, because they need that exceptionalism to stay on top.
Think about it. If a self-proclaimed holy man has to rely on his intellect, his logic, and the written code, just like the poorest farmer, he loses his special status.
He is equalized.
And they cannot stand that. The firewall of finality threatens to completely obliterate their business model. So what do?
They must try to bypass it.
They attempt another linguistic bypass. The source text points out that to get around the finality firewall, sectarian and mystic groups invented an entirely new vocabulary.
Or gilded speech.
Exactly. They knew they couldn't use the forbidden word prophet that would trigger the system's immune response immediately. The public would reject them. So they claimed ongoing, direct inspiration using new titles. They invented the concept of the muhadath.
Okay, pause. Muhadath. I have never heard that term before. What does that actually mean in practice for a society?
A muhadath literally means someone who is spoken to by God. They claimed, yes, the era of prophets bringing new law is officially over. But the era of saints who receive direct personal communication from the divine is still active.
Ah, so they just changed the title on the door but kept doing the exact same job.
Exactly. And they paired this with concepts like ilham, which means direct divine inspiration, and kashf, which means the mystical unveiling of hidden knowledge.
It's a massive loophole.
It's a total circumvention. They agreed to the terms of service publicly, no more prophets, while secretly writing a completely alternative operating system in the background based on their own unveiled knowledge.
It's so insidious. It's like saying, the book is for everyone, but the secret meaning of the book was unveiled only to me.
Exactly.
And this leads directly to what Parwez describes as the threat of the shadow government, which is a concept that absolutely blew my mind when I read the notes for this deep dive.
It is the ultimate socio-political power grab in human history. When you successfully convince the masses that you have access to secret divine knowledge through kashf or ilham, you are effectively creating an invisible, hierarchical shadow government.
It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it was actual social doctrine.
Oh, it was very real. The literature of these mystical groups in Parwez highlights this heavily, literally talks about a rigid hierarchy of spiritual beings who run the physical world from behind the scenes.
Let's define these terms because it sounds like a fantasy novel, but people live their actual lives under this fear. They had specific ranks, right?
Yes, highly specific ranks. They claimed the world was managed by the Quata, who is the central axis or the supreme spiritual leader of the age.
Like an invisible emperor.
Yes. And below him are the Abdal, who are the substitutes or regional managers. Then the Atad, who act as the pillars holding up the corners of the earth.
They literally set up an invisible cabinet.
A completely unaccountable, invisible cabinet. They claim that the actual physical rulers, the kings, the presidents, the magistrates, are just puppets acting on a stage. The real power, the invisible remote control of the universe, is held by these secret spiritual masters.
I want to ground this in reality for a second. If I am an average citizen, say a farmer living in the 9th or 10th century, how is this shadow government concept actually affecting my daily life? Why does it matter to me?
It matters because it fundamentally alters how you respond to injustice.
How so?
Okay, if a corrupt tax collector comes and steals your harvest, the active written constitution says, stand up, use the law, take him to court, and demand justice.
Right, take action.
But the gilded speech of the shadow government says, do not resist. This tax collector is just an illusion. The Quatabeb, the supreme spiritual master, has decreed this suffering for your spiritual elevation.
Wow.
So go to the shrine of the saint, offer a donation, and pray that the Abdal intervenes for you in the invisible realm.
Oh, man. It completely castrates the population's political will. It replaces civil rights with superstition.
And connect that to the bigger picture. Why do the elites build this? Because if you demand total obedience from the masses based on your invisible spiritual rank, you completely, 100% avoid all accountability to the written, objective constitution.
Because you can't question the invisible.
Right. If a political leader makes a mistake, the citizens can point to the law and hold him accountable. But if a spiritual master does something that violates the Constitution, he just claims it was based on kash.
Hidden knowledge.
Hidden knowledge that you, the uninitiated dirty masses, cannot possibly understand.
It's the perfect crime. It demands absolute, unquestioning power with zero responsibility. I mean, you can't audit an invisible ledger. You can't impeach an invisible governor.
No, you can't.
They have successfully bypassed the Khatm-e-Nubuwwat firewall by simply renaming the back door. They reestablished personality worship and absolute dictatorship under the unassailable guise of piety.
And that takes us right back to the beginning of our deep dive. Back to the fitna, the diagnostic fire in Surah Al-Hajj.
The assaying process.
Yes. How do you know who has a diseased heart? How does the system assay the metal? You watch who demands unquestionable obedience based on secret knowledge.
Right.
You watch who tries to override the clear, written, objective law with gilded, mystical speech. The ones building and defending the shadow government, they are the slag. The fire has exposed them.
Okay, let's step back and take a breath, because we have painted a picture of a system under massive assault. With all this incredibly sophisticated malware flooding the network, we're talking about gilded speech, fabricated abrogations, time-delayed traditions, entirely fake shadow governments demanding your money and obedience. How does any healthy component of the system survive?
It seems impossible.
Right. If the attack vectors are this relentless and this psychologically comforting to the masses, how does the true message not just get completely overridden and lost to history?
This is where we see the absolute brilliance of the system's core design, and it brings us to the fourth major concept we need to pull from Parwez analysis, the law of requital.
The law of requital.
Yes. It is all about strict cause and effect in the civilizational code.
Right, because verses 52 and 53 don't just talk about the diseased hearts. The diagnostic fire doesn't only expose the bad, it validates the good. It provides a direct contrast.
Exactly. While the diseased and hardened hearts are frantically latching onto these backdoor exploits to maintain their power and soothe their petrified minds, the text says that those who have been given knowledge easily recognize the authentic original message.
I really want to focus on that specific phrase, given knowledge. Because in religious contexts, you usually hear phrases like given blind faith, or given a spiritual awakening, or given an emotional high. But this explicitly says knowledge.
Yes, and that distinction is everything. It implies a highly active, rational, objective process. When a healthy component of the system, a citizen who is actually utilizing their intellect, encounters the counterfeit data, they don't just have a vague feeling that it's wrong.
They can prove it.
They know it is mathematically and legally wrong because it contradicts the foundational code. They have an objective standard, the finalized written document to measure it against. They hold the gilded speech up to the light of the Constitution, and they see the lead underneath.
And what is the psychological and sociological result of that recognition? Because the text says their hearts settle on the truth. What does that mean, practically speaking?
Settle is a fascinating and deliberate word choice here. It indicates stability, tranquility, a firm, unshakable grounding. Think about the contrast.
Okay.
When you operate purely on emotional hysteria, on gilded speech, and personality cults, your state of mind is incredibly volatile. You are constantly chasing the next spiritual high.
Always off down.
You are always waiting for the next miraculous claim from your guru, or worrying that you haven't appeased the invisible Qatbai. It's exhausting.
You are building your house on sand.
Exactly. But when you operate on objective knowledge and a consistent egalitarian constitution, your intellect finds peace. The system makes sense, it's predictable, it's just, and it's reliable.
There are no hidden trapdoors.
Right. You know your rights, you know your responsibilities, and you know that no human being has the right to claim divine superiority over you. Your heart settles.
So the law of requital at play here is essentially this. Your response to the counterfeit is itself the verdict on the state of your heart.
Perfectly stated.
The punishment for falling for the counterfeit isn't necessarily, lightning striking you from the sky. The punishment is that you become permanently trapped in the delusion you chose.
That is the essence of the law of requital. The choice is the consequence. If you demand personality cults, if you insist on unquestionable gurus who possess secret knowledge, and if you prefer magical thinking over the hard work of practical socioeconomic justice, then you have failed the essaying process.
You failed the test.
The system has diagnosed you as compromised. Your reward is the extreme schism, the intellectual stagnation, and the subservience you have willingly walked into. You become a subject instead of a citizen.
But on the flip side, if you demand evidence, if you insist on consistency with the finalized constitutional code, and if you fiercely protect your intellectual freedom against those trying to put it to sleep with gilded speech, then you are the gold.
You are.
You are the resilient node the system is looking for to build the next phase of civilization.
This is exactly what Allama Iqbal meant when he said that the original code, finalized by the concept of Khatm-e-Nubuwwat, was meant to permanently break the chains of personality worship.
It's a chain breaker.
The entire purpose of that firewall and the finalized constitution is to make the community the most intellectually free on earth. No human being ever again has the legal or spiritual right to stand up and say, obey me because God talks to me and not to you.
It completely obliterates spiritual feudalism.
It does. It creates a society of intellectual equals bound only by a mutually agreed upon objective law. That is a terrifying prospect for anyone who wants to be a dictator, whether they want to be a political dictator or a spiritual one.
Which perfectly explains why they fight it so hard with their shadow governments, their abrogations, and their gilded speech. They are terrified of an intellectually free, rational populace.
They absolutely are. And that leads us to the ultimate synthesis of this entire deep dive.
Right.
If we pull all these complex sociological threads together, the diagnostic fire of fitna, the mechanics of gilded speech, the systemic firewalls of finality, and the objective law of requital, what is the grand takeaway for civilizational resilience?
The ultimate system's insight.
A healthy civilizational movement does not merely survive infiltration. It uses infiltration to strengthen itself.
Wow. It doesn't just endure the hack, it utilizes the hack.
Think about biological systems. Think about a human immune system, or a muscle, or any anti-fragile network. When a new virus attacks your body, a healthy immune system doesn't just passively endure the fever and hope for the best.
No, it goes to work.
It actively analyzes the threat. It produces targeted antibodies, it destroys the pathogen, and it emerges from that encounter measurably stronger with a permanent biological memory of how to defeat that specific attack vector in the future.
Or like lifting weights. You actively introduce stress and micro tears to the muscle fiber, and the body rebuilds it denser and stronger than it was before.
Yes. So every attempted hijack of the Constitution, every piece of gilded speech thrown into the societal discourse, once it is exposed to the blazing light of the foundational code, forces the community to articulate its values more clearly.
It forces them to exercise their intellect.
Exactly. It naturally purges the system of the passive, the rigid, or the corrupt actors who reveal themselves by joining the hijackers. And it clarifies exactly who the real intellectually robust members are.
That is the core civilizational lesson we can draw from Parwez's analysis of these two verses. And honestly, it completely shifts our paradigm on historical conflict.
It changes everything.
Because normally we look at the history of ideological movements, we see the schisms, the betrayals, the corruptions, the shadow governments, and we despair. We throw our hands up and think, well, the system failed. The bad guys won.
But this analytical paradigm says, no, the system is working perfectly. The assaying process is active. The fire is burning.
So the lesson is, do not fear that falsehood or bad actors or corrupt data will appear within a true program. This is not a failure of the program. That is a historical inevitability. It is the fire designed to test the ore.
What you should fear, what should truly keep you up at night, is a community whose intellectual immune system is so compromised, so addicted to blind following, and so seduced by the comforting warmth of gilded speech that it can no longer tell the counterfeit from the original.
That's the real danger.
A community that welcomes the Trojan horse, not because they are tricked, but because they think the wood is pretty and they don't want to do the hard work of guarding the gates.
That is the only true existential threat. When the fire of fitna comes, if you have abandoned reason, you will burn with the dross. But if you hold to the objective finalized code, you emerge as pure gold.
Exactly right.
This has been an absolutely incredible journey through these concepts. We started with the idea of a diagnostic tool, and we've ended up with a complete sociological blueprint for an anti-fragile civilization. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Take this with you.
I want you to take this 1,400-year-old framework and apply it directly to your own modern life. Look at the institutions, the corporations, the political parties, or the social movements you belong to right now.
Pay attention to what happens.
When a disruptive, self-serving idea, a piece of modern gilded speech, enters those spaces, how does your community react? Does its immune system quickly isolate the bad actors by relying on core, objective principles and demanding evidence?
Or does it reward them?
Exactly. Does it reward them, mesmerized by their charisma, their emotional appeals, and their unearned authority? Your answer to that question will tell you exactly which stage of the civilizational assaying process you are currently living through. Keep your intellect sharp, keep your heart sound, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.